Let me tell you something I've come to understand after years of watching people navigate the intricate dance of human connection. There's a moment that arrives at every gathering, every party, every social event, where the noise becomes too much and the faces blur together, and you feel this peculiar emptiness settling into your chest despite being surrounded by dozens of voices. You've probably felt it yourself. That specific exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with something deeper, something that whispers you don't quite belong in spaces that others seem to inhabit so effortlessly. And here's what I need you to hear first, before anything else. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you. The weariness you experience when surrounded by people isn't a malfunction of your personality or evidence of some social deficiency that needs correcting. You are simply constructed differently, wired with an alternative architecture of consciousness that processes the world through channels that run deeper and quieter than the broad, bright highways that extroverts travel. I've spent considerable time observing how energy moves through different types of people, and the patterns reveal themselves if you watch closely enough. Extroverts operate like broadcast towers, sending signals outward and drawing vitality from the responses that bounce back to them. They speak, and the act of speaking energizes them. They engage, and the engagement itself becomes fuel. It's a beautiful system, perfectly designed for certain kinds of existence, but it represents only one way of being human. You, on the other hand, function more like a deep-sea sensor array, constantly receiving and processing vast quantities of subtle information that most people don't even register exists, while others skim across the surface of social interaction. You're diving beneath it, absorbing emotional frequencies, detecting the microcurrents of tension and harmony, cataloging the 1,000 tiny discrepancies between what people say and what their bodies reveal. This isn't a choice you make. It's simply how your nervous system engages with reality. And this kind of profound absorption, this depth of processing, requires enormous amounts of energy to sustain. Consider what actually happens when you enter a room full of people. You might think you're just having conversations, just participating in normal human exchange, but that description doesn't capture even a fraction of what your consciousness is actually doing. You're reading micro-expressions that flash across faces in fractions of seconds. You're detecting the slight tightening around someone's eyes that betrays anxiety beneath their confident words. You're picking up on the subtle shift in vocal tone that indicates hurt feelings being masked by laughter. You're sensing the emotional temperature of the entire room, the undercurrents of competition or warmth or tension that flow beneath the surface chatter. You're registering body language, tracking conversational dynamics, noting who's being excluded and who's dominating, feeling the weight of unspoken conflicts and unexpressed affections. All of this happens simultaneously, mostly below your conscious awareness, and it's utterly exhausting because you're not just observing the social situation, you're feeling it, absorbing it into your own nervous system where it reverberates and requires processing. The people around you at these gatherings are probably not conducting this same depth of analysis. They're engaged, certainly, but they're skating across the surface where you're diving into the depths. And this creates a peculiar isolation, doesn't it? You're surrounded by humans, yet experiencing something fundamentally different from what they're experiencing. You notice the performance aspect of social interaction with uncomfortable clarity. Everyone is playing a role to some degree, presenting a curated version of themselves, and you can feel the gap between the performance and the authentic self underneath. This awareness creates what I call the exhaustion of pretense. You're simultaneously expected to participate in the performance yourself while being acutely conscious of its artificiality. It's like being asked to dance enthusiastically to music you can clearly hear is off-key, while everyone else seems genuinely transported by it. I remember watching a friend of mine, a brilliant woman who happens to be deeply introverted, at a professional networking event. She was doing everything right by conventional standards, smiling, asking questions, appearing engaged. But I could see the energy draining from her in real time, as if someone had pulled a plug, and her vitality was slowly spiraling away. When I asked her about it later, she described the experience with striking precision. It's not that I dislike people or can't interact. It's that I'm processing everything at such a deep level that by the second hour, I've absorbed more emotional and social data than my system can metabolize. I feel like I've run a marathon, except the marathon happened entirely inside my nervous system. This is the reality that extroverts often struggle to comprehend. For them, social interaction is regenerative. For you, it's consumptive. And so you retreat. You find yourself slipping away from gatherings earlier than others, seeking quiet corners, craving solitude with an urgency that can feel almost physical. Society has taught you to interpret this as antisocial behavior, as something to overcome or apologize for. But let me reframe this completely. Solitude for you is not deprivation, it's restoration. When extroverts find themselves alone, they often experience it as understimulation, a deficit of the social energy they need to feel alive. You experience it as the opposite. In solitude, you can finally drop the mask that social situations require. You can stop processing other people's emotional frequencies and attend to your own. You can let your nervous system settle, allow the accumulated data to be digested and integrated. Permit yourself to simply exist without performance or analysis. This isn't running away from life. This is returning to yourself, reconnecting with the inner landscape that gets overwhelmed and obscured in the noise of social engagement. What makes this more challenging is that we've collectively organized our society around values and structures that privilege extroversion. The modern world celebrates those who can network effortlessly, who thrive in open offices, who draw energy from constant collaboration and interaction. Breadth of connection is valued over depth of understanding. The ability to work a room is considered more valuable than the ability to sit alone with difficult ideas until clarity emerges. Schools are designed for group projects and classroom participation. Workplaces reward those who speak up in meetings, regardless of whether what they're saying has been carefully considered. Even our social lives are structured around large gatherings and public displays of connection. In this environment, those who need quiet to think, who prefer one-on-one conversations to group dynamics, who find their greatest insights in solitary reflection, are often pathologized. Something must be wrong with them. They must be shy, or anxious, or socially awkward. They need to come out of their shell, be more outgoing, learn to enjoy parties. But here's a truth that gets buried under these cultural assumptions. Sensitivity is not weakness. The depth of processing that makes social situations exhausting for you also grants you perceptual abilities that others simply don't possess. You see patterns that remain invisible to those skating across surfaces. You understand emotional complexity with nuance and subtlety. You pick up on the things people aren't saying, the needs they're not expressing, the pain they're hiding behind practiced smiles. This capacity for deep perception allows you to experience life with a richness that can be both gift and burden. You feel music more profoundly. You notice beauty in details others overlook. You understand the layers and contradictions in human nature because you're actually paying attention to them. Yes, this comes at a cost. You can't just glide through social situations without being touched by them. But the alternative is a kind of superficiality that would diminish your experience of being alive. The world actually needs what you bring to it, though it doesn't always recognize or honor this need. Think about the art that moves you, the books that change how you see reality, the scientific discoveries that emerge from years of solitary focus, the insights about human nature that require someone to step back from the noise and actually observe what's happening. These things rarely come from the center of the party. They emerge in quiet rooms where someone with the patience for deep thinking and the sensitivity to perceive subtle patterns sits with questions long enough for answers to reveal themselves. People like you have given humanity much of what makes it beautiful and much of what makes it wise. The contemplative traditions, the philosophical frameworks that help us understand existence, the literature that captures the complexity of inner life. These are the fruits of introverted consciousness engaging deeply with reality rather than skimming across its surface. I want you to pause here for a moment and consider something. If this perspective on introversion resonates with you, if it's helping you see your own nature with less judgment and more understanding, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to this channel so we can continue exploring these ideas together. And here's something I'm genuinely curious about. Think of one word that describes how you feel when you're finally alone after a long social gathering. Just one word that captures that specific sensation of returning to yourself. Take a second to let that word surface in your mind. What is it? I ask, because I've found that the vocabulary people use to describe their relationship with solitude reveals so much about how they've been taught to interpret their own needs. Some people immediately think of words tinged with guilt: selfish, antisocial, rude. Others access words of relief: peace, exhale, home. The word that comes to you says something about whether you've accepted your nature or are still fighting it. Hold on to that word. We'll come back to it. Now, understanding all of this intellectually is one thing. Actually living in alignment with your introverted nature while navigating a world structured for extroverts requires something different. It requires permission. Permission to honor what you need rather than constantly contorting yourself to fit expectations designed for a different nervous system. You can leave gatherings early without manufacturing elaborate excuses or feeling like you've somehow failed at being human. You can decline invitations to events you know will drain you without providing a thesis defense of your decision. You can seek out the one-on-one conversations that actually nourish you instead of forcing yourself to mingle in large groups where connection remains stubbornly superficial. You can take breaks during social events, to step outside, to find a quiet corner, to let your system reset for a few minutes. You can stop measuring your social life against the extrovert's template and start designing one that actually works for how you're built. This isn't about becoming a hermit or rejecting human connection. It's about understanding that meaningful connection looks different for different types of people. An extrovert might feel deeply connected after spending an evening at a party, engaging with 20 different people in brief, energizing exchanges. You might feel that same depth of connection after 2 hours of uninterrupted conversation with one person who's willing to go beneath the surface with you. Neither experience is superior. They're simply different pathways to the same fundamental human need for belonging and understanding. The problem arises when one pathway is treated as the default, and all others are seen as deficient versions of it. I've noticed something fascinating that happens when introverts stop trying to be extroverts and instead embrace their actual nature. They begin attracting different kinds of relationships. The friendships that form when you're authentic rather than performing tend to be deeper, more nourishing, built on genuine compatibility rather than forced interaction. When you stop saying yes to every social invitation out of obligation and start being selective about where you invest your limited social energy, you create space for the connections that actually matter. The people who appreciate you for who you actually are, someone who listens deeply, thinks carefully, feels intensely, and needs time alone to process it all. These people become your community. And this community might be smaller than the sprawling social networks that extroverts naturally build, but it runs deeper. Quality versus quantity isn't just a platitude. It's a description of how introverted connection actually functions. There's a kind of freedom that emerges when you finally accept that you're not broken, just different. You stop interpreting your need for solitude as something shameful and start experiencing it as essential self-care. You quit forcing yourself to be the life of the party. and instead become comfortable being the thoughtful presence at the edge of the room, the person who's really listening while others are waiting for their turn to talk. You recognize that the exhaustion you feel after social interaction is not a character flaw, but a physiological response to the way your nervous system processes information. This recognition doesn't make the exhaustion disappear, but it transforms your relationship with it. Instead of feeling defective for getting tired, you simply acknowledge that this is how your system works, and plan accordingly. Think about how much energy you've wasted over the years trying to be someone you're not. All those parties you forced yourself to attend and stay at longer than felt comfortable. All those group activities you agreed to despite knowing they'd leave you depleted. All the times you've judged yourself harshly for preferring a quiet evening at home to a crowded social event, interpreting this preference as evidence of your failure to be properly human. What if you took all that energy you've been spending on self-criticism and trying to fit an ill-fitting template, and instead redirected it toward understanding and honoring your actual needs? What might become possible then? The truth is that authentic living requires courage, especially when your authenticity doesn't match cultural expectations. It takes real bravery to say, "I need to leave now," when the party is still going strong and everyone else seems to be having a wonderful time. It takes strength to prioritize your well-being over other people's comfort or expectations. It takes confidence to stop apologizing for being yourself. But this bravery is worth cultivating because the alternative is a life spent in constant low-level distress, always feeling slightly out of sync with your environment, perpetually exhausted from trying to be something you're not. I think about the concept of energy management differently now than I used to. For years, I approached it as something to overcome. If I just pushed through the exhaustion, if I just forced myself to be more social, eventually I'd build up some kind of tolerance and become comfortable in settings that drained me. But that's not how it works. You don't become an extrovert through exposure therapy. You just become an increasingly exhausted introvert. Energy management for introverts is actually about honest accounting. You have a certain amount of social energy available. Some activities and interactions will replenish it. Most will deplete it. And you need to budget accordingly. This isn't being selfish or antisocial. It's being realistic about your resources so you can show up as your best self when it actually matters, rather than spreading yourself so thin that you're perpetually running on empty. And here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions about introversion. The depth of your inner life is not a consolation prize for poor social skills. It's not what you get stuck with because you can't hack it in the external world. Your rich internal landscape, your capacity for reflection and analysis, your ability to be content in your own company, these are genuine strengths, not compensations for weakness. The modern world, with its constant noise and distraction, its valorization of busyness and visible productivity, makes it easy to devalue the quieter forms of human excellence. But the ability to be alone with yourself without immediately reaching for distraction, to sit with difficult thoughts and feelings until understanding emerges, to find satisfaction in internal exploration rather than external stimulation, this is a profound capability that many people lack and some never develop. Consider what happens in solitude for you versus what happens for others. Many people experience being alone as uncomfortable, even threatening. Their thoughts immediately turn negative, or they feel anxious without the distraction of social interaction, or they simply become bored and restless. They need external stimulation to feel alive, to know who they are. But you've likely discovered that solitude can be genuinely pleasurable, even necessary. In quiet moments, insights surface that get drowned out by noise. Creative ideas emerge that require space to develop. You process the experiences and emotions that accumulate during social interaction, integrating them into your understanding rather than just moving from one stimulating experience to the next without digestion. This capacity for productive solitude is valuable beyond measure, and it's something that can't be rushed or forced or achieved through constant activity. The world is starting to recognize what it's been missing by organizing itself exclusively around extroverted values. There's growing awareness that open offices, which were supposed to foster collaboration and creativity, often just create constant distraction and prevent the deep focus that complex problem-solving requires. There's emerging understanding that not every valuable contribution happens in meetings, that some of the most important thinking happens in quiet spaces where people can concentrate without interruption. There's increasing appreciation for the kind of listening and perception that introverts bring to relationships and communities. The ability to truly hear what someone is saying rather than just waiting to speak. The capacity to notice what's not being said. The skill of creating space for others to be authentic. But regardless of whether broader culture comes to value what you bring, you can value it yourself. You can recognize that your way of being in the world is not a lesser version of extroversion, but a different and equally valid approach to human existence. You can honor your need for depth over breadth, for meaningful one-on-one connection over superficial group interaction, for quiet reflection over constant stimulation. You can build a life that works with your nature rather than against it, that recognizes your limits not as failures, but as boundaries that protect your well-being and allow you to function at your best. I want to leave you with this. You are not obligated to exhaust yourself trying to meet standards that were never designed with you in mind. The metrics of success and connection that dominate our culture, the size of your social network, the number of events you attend, your comfort with public speaking, your enjoyment of parties, these measure one type of human flourishing, but certainly not the only type. Your flourishing might look quieter, more internal, less visible to outside observers. It might involve long walks alone where ideas crystallize, evenings spent with one close friend in deep conversation, hours devoted to creating something that requires sustained focus, time set aside for the kind of reflection that can't happen in the midst of constant social stimulation. If this exploration of introversion has given you a new lens through which to understand yourself, I hope you'll consider subscribing to continue these conversations. I create this content because I believe there are truths about human nature that get buried under cultural assumptions, and excavating them matters. More than that, though, I'm curious about your experience. What's one thing you've learned about yourself from this discussion? Or one way it's shifted how you think about your social exhaustion? How has understanding the depth of your processing changed your relationship with solitude? I'm genuinely interested in hearing your story, the specific contours of your experience navigating the world as someone who feels things deeply and needs quiet to restore themselves. Share your reflections in the comments, not because I'm asking for engagement metrics, but because there's a community here of people who understand what it's like to be wired this way. And your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to feel less alone in their experience. Thank you for spending this time with me, for bringing your full attention to these ideas, and for having the courage to see your introversion not as something to fix, but as an integral part of who you are.